In the deep chill of prehistoric Europe, long before cities or kingdoms, Neanderthals stood as resilient survivors in a world defined by ice and hardship. The continent during their reign, spanning roughly 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, was an unforgiving landscape. Towering glaciers, dense forests, and vast tundras stretched across what would one day be modern France, Germany, and Ukraine. Temperatures could plummet without warning. Storms swept across the land. In this setting, shelter was not a comfort, it was a matter of life and death. Unlike modern humans who emerged from the warmer savannas of Africa, Neanderthals evolved in the cold. Their short, stocky builds helped conserve heat, while their large nasal passages warmed the frigid air they breathed. But physical adaptation alone was not enough. The cold clawed at every exposed inch of skin, seeped into bones during sleep, and made daily survival a test of ingenuity. To stand a chance, Neanderthals had to create spaces that could guard them against the ruthless climate. The earliest signs of shelter are faint, but they tell a story of necessity and adaptation. At first, Neanderthals likely sought refuge in what nature offered. Caves and rock overhangs provided immediate protection from wind and snow. These natural shelters were abundant in the limestone regions of Europe. Their thick stone walls kept out the worst of the cold and served as stable bases for hunting, resting, and tool-making. Archaeological sites such as La Chapelle, Saint-Sanfer, and Spy Cave reveal how these environments became more than temporary hideouts. They were the backdrops of Neanderthal life. But reliance on caves also presented challenges. Not all regions had suitable caves, and competition with predators like cave bears meant that Neanderthals needed more flexible strategies. The question was not just where to hide, it was how to live. That question set in motion a gradual shift in their relationship with the land. Over time, their use of natural formations grew more strategic. Caves facing away from prevailing winds were preferred. Entrances were blocked with stones or animal hides. Fire pits were placed carefully to warm the interior without choking it with smoke. Each decision added a layer of sophistication to what was simple survival. As glacial cycles came and went, Neanderthals experienced not one but multiple climate regimes. Some periods were colder and harsher than others. These fluctuations pushed their ingenuity further. In colder phases, even cave shelters became insufficient. Snow might drift inside, or icy winds might hell straight through an entrance. The Neanderthals responded not by retreating, but by adapting. Their understanding of the environment deepened with every generation. They learned which valleys trapped heat, which ridges blocked storms, and where resources were reliably found even in winter. Early shelter-building efforts likely began with windbreaks and temporary hide structures placed at cave entrances. These additions may have been simple at first. Branches leaned against rock walls, hides stretched over bone frames. But they marked a turning point. For the first time, humans were not just using the land, they were modifying it to suit their needs. This shift was subtle, almost invisible in the archaeological record, but it paved the way for the construction techniques that would later define Neanderthals' survival. Archaeological evidence at sites like La Ferracie and Capena shows not only hearths and tools, but also signs of repeated habitation. Ash layers from old fires, organized zones for butchering and tool use, and even potential burial spots. These were not random encampments, they were places of return, memory, and meaning. As Neanderthals became more rooted in
particular regions, their shelters reflected their growing connection to the land.
The ability to create protective space was perhaps one of their most important innovations. It allowed Neanderthals to stay in one place longer, conserve energy during winters, and support small groups through the most brutal months. Shelter meant warmth, security, and continuity. It allowed the old to rest, the young to grow, and knowledge to be shared in the frozen silence of prehistoric Europe. A well-built shelter was a triumph of mind over environment. And yet, these early efforts were only the beginning. As the cold deepened and Neanderthals moved into more open, less hospitable terrains, their ingenuity would be tested like never before. The question was no longer just how to find shelter, but how to build it from nothing. That evolution from cave dweller to cold climate builder would become one of the most compelling stories of their survival. As the Ice Age deepened and landscapes transformed under the weight of advancing glaciers, Neanderthals began to make choices that shaped not just their movements, but their way of life. The land was not just a backdrop for survival, it was a map of opportunity and risk. Choosing where to build or settle was a decision of precision born from generations of observation. In the vast wilderness of Ice Age Europe, success began with location. Neanderthals did not wander blindly. Though often thought of as nomadic, they moved with purpose, returning to sites where food was abundant, water flowed nearby, and shelter could be secured. Evidence from repeated occupations in places like Cumgrinel in France or the Zafa Cave in Spain suggests a pattern of deliberate settlement. Valleys protected from northern winds, forest edges rich in game, and cliffs offering natural coverage became valuable real estate. These decisions reflected a deep familiarity with their territory, one that could only come from lifetimes of experience. Caves remained ideal when available, but they were not found everywhere. In the vast steppes and high plateaus of Eastern Europe, Neanderthals confronted open terrain with no natural shelters in sight. In these conditions, location scouting became a matter of life or death. They sought depressions in the ground, sheltered riverbanks, and the leeward side of ridges. Any feature that could buffer the relentless wind and trap warmth. The land itself became a tool, and Neanderthals learned how to read it like a survival manual. Seasonality also played a critical role in settlement decisions. Neanderthals understood the rhythm of the land, the migratory patterns of prey, the seasonal freeze of rivers, the first signs of approaching storms. They timed their movements to match these patterns, often returning to familiar locations during predictable times of year. Springtime hunts drew them to valleys rich in reindeer and red deer. Winter sent them into forested lands or cave systems where fire and insulation could preserve precious body heat. Their shelter decisions were guided by knowledge passed down through generations. The size of their social groups also influenced where and how they built or settled. A family band of 10 might need only a small rock overhang to survive a winter week, while a larger group would require a broader clearing or more extensive shelter to accommodate its members. Group size likely fluctuated with the seasons, contracting in winter for mobility and warmth, expanding in summer during communal hunts or resource sharing. Their ability to adapt shelter location based on group needs highlights the flexibility of their social and environmental strategies. Water access was non-negotiable. Shelters were rarely more than a short walk from streams, springs, or seasonal melt sources. Not only for drinking, but water was essential for cleaning tools, processing hides, and sometimes even butchering large prey. A good water source could be the difference between health and disease. But this access came with trade-offs. Waterways attracted predators and risked flooding during thaw. Neanderthals learned to balance proximity with safety, choosing slightly elevated spots near water but out of reach of its dangers. Defensibility was another factor. Though not living in constant fear, Neanderthals were not alone in these cold lands. Large carnivores such as cave lions, hyenas, and bears shared their spaces. Locations with limited approaches, like rock-walled aloves or narrow ridge paths, provided better odds of defense and visibility. In some cases, Neanderthals may have modified the landscape slightly, moving rocks or placing barriers to improve security. Their acute awareness of risk shows a level of planning that was far from primitive. The orientation of a site also mattered. South-facing slopes and cave mouths captured more sunlight during the day, a crucial advantage in frigid climates. Even without compasses or scientific tools, Neanderthals grasped the subtle geometry of the Earth's relationship with the sun. Their intuitive understanding of warmth, wind, and shelter direction made all the difference when constructing or choosing their homes. Such decisions speak not just to adaptation, but to cognition, a mind capable of processing and anticipating environmental patterns. Each chosen site became more than a location. It became a stage for daily life, where food was shared, stories possibly told, tools crafted, and relationships formed. As the ice thickened and the winds grew harsher, the ability to read the land and place their shelters in its most favorable nooks became one of the Neanderthals' greatest strengths. In their silence, their stone tools, and the footprints left behind in once frozen soil, we glimpse a people deeply in tune with their world. But as their understanding of the land grew, so too did their ambitions. Choosing a good spot was only the beginning. In places where nature offered little, Neanderthals began to reshape their environments. They stopped relying solely on the Earth's gifts and started building their own protections, constructing barriers, framing shelters, and layering insulation where none existed. Site selection and environmental knowledge. Before, as the Ice Age gripped Europe in cycles of bitter cold, Neanderthals looked to the ancient stone around them for protection. Caves formed by geological forces over millennia became their first and most enduring homes. These natural fortresses offered shelter from icy winds, snow-laden skies, and prowling predators. But the cave was more than just a hiding place. It became a stage for survival, adaptation, and daily life. The archaeological record tells us that Neanderthals returned again and again to certain caves, transforming them from mere geological features into lived-in spaces. Places like Shanidar in Iraq, Lari in France, and El Cedron in Spain reveal layers of ash, bone, tools, and even burials. These repeated occupations suggested deep familiarity with specific locations, possibly passed down across generations. Caves were not randomly chosen. They were remembered, revisited, and reshaped over time. Once inside, Neanderthals did not passively occupy these spaces. They organized them. Fire pits, often centrally located, served as both hearth and hub. Around these fires, warmth radiated, light flickered, and food was prepared. Remnants of charred bones. Ash layers and stone circles around hearths give us glimpses of how space was arranged near the fire. Skins might be laid for sleeping in corners. Stone tools were shaped and sharpened along walls. Bones were piled, perhaps awaiting further use or disposal. This spatial organization points to planning and routine, a recognition of shared space and purposeful division of labor. Caves also offered acoustic and visual shelter. The echoes of speech, laughter, or alarm would travel differently in enclosed stone, adding a sensory layer to communal life. The flicker of firelight on cave walls, casting shadows that danced and shifted, might have influenced emotional or symbolic thought. Though we cannot say for certain whether Neanderthals viewed these spaces spiritually, the deliberate placement of burials in cave sites suggests some deeper awareness of place and permanence. The orientation of cave entrances mattered greatly. South-facing caves were warmer and brighter, capturing more sunlight during the day. This passive solar benefit was crucial in maintaining internal temperatures and reducing the need for constant fire. Entrances often faced away from prevailing winds, protecting inhabitants from chilling gusts. Some caves were chosen not only for warmth, but also for access to resources, close to game trails, flint outcrops, or water sources. These decisions show a strategic mind, one that understood the landscape intimately. But cave life also had its limits. Darkness reigned beyond the reach of firelight. Moisture could collect in lower sections, making parts of the cave cold and damp. Inhabitants had to contend with bats, insects, and the constant risk of collapse or flooding. Still, the advantages outweighed the dangers. Within stone walls, Neanderthals found continuity, a place to return, repair, and rebuild. As seasons changed, shelter meant survival, but it also meant stability, and caves offered both in abundance. Not all caves were used equally. Some were short-term shelters, occupied only during a hunt or migration. Others, like those at La Chapelle-Saint-Litz, show long-term use, with signs of repeated habitation, burial activity, and domestic routines. The duration and purpose of use shaped how Neanderthals arranged these spaces. Temporary camps might show minimal modification, just a hearth and some flakes. Long-term dwellings revealed complex organization, repeated fire use, and even possible structures within caves to divide or enhance the space. Perhaps most telling is the presence of personal care and group life within these shelters. At Shanidar, a male individual with multiple injuries lived long after he could have hunted or defended himself. This suggests he was cared for, fed, protected, and kept warm. Within the safety of a cave, such care would be nearly impossible without stable shelter. The cave, in these cases, became not just a refuge from nature, but a cradle of social cohesion. With each occupation, the cave bore witness to stories now lost, of shared meals, winter nights, quiet births, and solemn farewells. Through firelight and stone, Neanderthals built a rhythm of life that pulsed even in the coldest months. And yet, not all landscapes offered caves. As their range expanded and climate conditions shifted, Neanderthals were forced to innovate in regions where stone offered no sanctuary. They would craft their own. In regions where caves were scarce, Neanderthals faced a more daunting challenge, surviving the cold without the natural embrace of stone. Open landscapes stretched across much of Ice Age Europe, from windswept plains to river valleys, leaving few places to hide from the freezing winds. But rather than retreat, Neanderthals responded with innovation. In these exposed environments, caves as homes, daily life and organization. They began building shelters of their own. Archaeological traces of these constructed homes are rare, but where they appear, they speak volumes. One of the most revealing sites is Molodova I, situated near the Diesta River in modern-day Ukraine. There, remnants of a structure nearly 7 meters wide were found built from mammoth bones and tusks. While no wooden framework survived, the pattern of post holes and the deliberate arrangement of bones suggest a well-planned dwelling. The structure likely included a framework of branches and animal hides stretched tight to keep out the wind and layered to trap warmth. Such shelters were not mere windbreaks. They were engineered for survival in a world where snowfall could blanket the land for months and icy winds cut through flesh and fabric. Neanderthals needed protection that was sturdy, insulated, and adaptable. Bones offered a durable frame when trees were scarce. Hides, harvested from large game like bison and mammoths, served as natural insulation. When layered and tightly secured, they formed weather-proof walls. Stones might be added at the base to weigh down the structure and anchor it against the wind. Inside these built shelters, Neanderthals likely recreated the comfort of cave life. Central hearths would provide heat and light. Sleeping areas were possibly arranged in the warmest spots, furthest from drafts. Activity zones for tool repair, food processing, and hide work could be divided by position or material. Even without permanent walls, the interior was likely organized with purpose and efficiency. The very act of creating a dwelling from raw material suggests an evolved capacity for planning, memory, and teamwork. The construction process itself may have been communal. Building a large structure from bones, wood, and hide required coordinated labor and shared knowledge. Tasks would be distributed, some cutting branches, others arranging supports, others preparing hides. Such cooperation hints at more than just survival. It reveals a social world capable of collective effort, shared goals, and perhaps even inherited building traditions passed from one group to the next. Flexibility was key. These shelters had to be tailored to the season, the terrain, and the availability of materials. In wooded regions, branches and bark could form the framework. In treeless plains, bone and stone took precedence. In particularly harsh winters, snow itself may have been used as insulation, piled around the outside of structures to trap warmth within. The variety of building materials and techniques shows how Neanderthals did not rely on one method, but adapted their architecture to meet the demands of each environment. Their choice to build also meant mobility. While caves were static and tied to specific geographies, constructed shelters allowed Neanderthals to occupy new territories. They could follow migrating herds across steppe and forest, setting up semi-permanent or temporary camps as needed. These portable homes expanded their range, allowing them to thrive even in areas previously considered too harsh or exposed. In doing so, they pushed the boundaries of human presence deeper into Ice Age Europe. Though most of these structures have long vanished, with decayed hides, disintegrated snow melted, the post holes, bone rings, and hearth remains endure as ghostly blueprints. They tell of homes once filled with warmth, activity, and human presence. For every cave we uncover, there may be dozens of vanished dwellings hidden beneath layers of soil and time. This evolution in shelter marked a turning point. Neanderthals were no longer just occupants of natural spaces. They had become creators of their own. Their homes were no longer dictated by geology, but by ingenuity. In the openness of the land, exposed to sky and storm, they carved out protection, using nothing but what they could carry, shape, and build. And yet, no shelter, no matter how well built, could shield them completely from the cold. Fire remained essential, the heart of the home, and the key to survival. In the next stage of their journey, Neanderthals would learn to master flame, not just as a tool, but as an indispensable companion to their shelter-building efforts in the frozen vastness of Ice Age Europe. Shelter could only go so far. Stone walls and hide coverings shielded Neanderthals from wind and snow, but it was fire that made these shelters habitable. Fire turned cold darkness into warmth and light. It cooked their food, dried their clothes, hardened their tools, and illuminated the long winter nights. More than a survival tool, fire became the hearth, the central pulse of every Neanderthal home. Neanderthals did not stumble blindly into fire use. Archaeological evidence from dozens of sites reveals repeated, controlled use of fire across millennia. Charred bones, layers of ash, burned hearthstones, and even patterns of blackened cave ceilings all tell of deliberate and sustained fire use, at sites like Péche-las-Fours in France and Kar in Israel. Hearths appear as carefully maintained features, some reused over time, and placed strategically within shelters to maximize warmth. The ability to create and control fire was not merely accidental. Flint tools found near hearths, often with signs of striking, suggest fire was intentionally ignited, using sparks, likely from striking pithorite or other iron-rich rocks against flint. This technique would have required skill, patience, and practice. Once lit, fires had to be fed and protected, especially in windy or snowy conditions. Maintaining fire in harsh climates was no passive task. It was a continuous effort woven into the daily rhythm of survival. The structure of hearths reveals a sophisticated understanding of fire's behavior. Some were shallow pits ringed with stones or bones to contain heat and ash. Others were dug deeper into the earth, providing both stability and wind protection. The placement of hearths, often in the center or slightly off to the side, shows that Neanderthals understood how to warm the space efficiently without choking it with smoke. Openings in shelters or cave vents likely served to channel out fumes while preserving internal warmth. But fire offered more than heat. It extended the day. In a world without electric light, darkness fell early and lasted long. Firelight allowed for evening activity, repairing tools, preparing hides, perhaps even sharing stories around the fire. The group gathered. The flickering light revealed faces, gestures, and expressions. It created a space of togetherness in a landscape of solitude. Though we cannot know their words, the scene is easy to imagine. Sparks rising into the cave ceiling, shadows dancing on hide walls. Fire, mastery, use, and social function. Fire also transformed food. Raw meat was difficult to chew, often unsafe to eat, and nutritionally less efficient. Cooking broke down fibers, released more energy, and made digestion easier. The presence of burned bones and cut marks suggests that Neanderthals roasted meat, perhaps using wooden spits or hot stones. This not only made food safer, it allowed them to access more calories, which was crucial in an environment where keeping body heat meant burning energy at a constant rate. Furthermore, fire played a vital role in tool making. Heat-treating stone could make flint easier to knap, producing sharper blades and more durable points. Fire-hardened wooden spears found at sites like Skåne in Germany reveal another layer of technological use. These spears, straightened and toughened in flame, were deadly tools, proof that fire's utility extended beyond shelter and warmth. The presence of multiple hearths in a single site also suggests that Neanderthals may have used fire to define space. Different fires may have served different functions: cooking in one area, warmth in another, tool making in a third. In some large shelters, fire placements imply social divisions or task-specific zones. This spatial awareness reflects not only practical planning, but the beginnings of domestic architecture. Fire helped create rooms where no walls existed. Perhaps most striking of all is the evidence of fire being maintained over long periods. In some cases, hearths were repaired or relit in the same exact spot across seasons. This continuity suggests a memory of place, a decision to return, rebuild, and rekindle not just the fire itself, but the life that revolved around it. Fire, in this way, became both a practical necessity and a symbol of continuity. Through fire, Neanderthals turned shelters into homes. They illuminated the cold, preserved their food, warmed their children, and strengthened their tools. Every spark struck in the dark was an act of defiance against the Ice Age, a declaration that life could push back against the elements. And yet their mastery of shelter and flame did not end here. With each new challenge, their construction methods grew more advanced and their tools more refined. The very act of building would evolve into a craft of its own. As Neanderthals moved deeper into varied and challenging landscapes, their shelters grew more sophisticated, not only in design, but in the tools used to build them. Crafting a functional shelter in the unforgiving cold was never a task of brute strength alone. It demanded planning, coordination, and precise handiwork. The evolution of Neanderthal toolkits reveal how they adapted their technology to manipulate wood, bone, hide, and stone in ways that transformed open land into livable space. The Mousterian tool tradition, named after the site of Loom Mouster in France, is closely associated with Neanderthals and offers a window into their building strategies. These tools, shaped primarily from flint, included scrapers, points, awls, and burins, each playing a distinct role in construction. Scrapers were used to prepare animal hides, thinning and softening them so they could be layered or sewn into coverings. Awls pierced holes in hides or bark. Burins etched or shaped hard materials like bone or wood. These weren't just weapons or hunting aids. They were construction tools, honed through centuries of refinement. When Neanderthals erected dwellings in open terrain, they needed to process large quantities of raw material. Wooden poles for framing, hides for insulation, stones for anchoring, all required preparation. Felling branches or cutting bone to size demanded sharp, durable edges. Neanderthals used prepared core techniques to craft flakes that could be resharpened multiple times, allowing for long-term projects like shelter construction. The presence of retouched flakes at habitation sites suggests that maintenance and tool reuse were part of the building cycle. Wood, while perishable and rarely preserved, was likely central to shelter construction. Its absence in the archaeological record is not evidence of its disuse, but a consequence of time and decay. Still, indirect clues abound. Impressions in soil, post-hole patterns, and charred remains suggest that Neanderthals harvested saplings and branches for shelter frames. To cut and shape these, they likely used large flakes or bifacial hand axes. Some tools show polish or wear patterns consistent with woodworking, adding weight to this reconstruction of prehistoric carpentry. Bone was another resource, not only for structural supports in mammoth bone huts, but also for tools. Large femurs or ribs could be used as digging implements, pounding stakes into frozen ground, or loosening compacted earth for fire pits and post holes. At Moldova and other sites, bone tools appear alongside hearths and construction features, underscoring their practical utility. These tools, far from crude, reflect an adaptive reuse of material that many other hominins overlooked. Binding was essential. Constructing a hide-coat shelter required fastening materials together securely. Though we lack direct evidence of Neanderthal cordage, the use of plant fibers or sinew is highly probable. In 2020, archaeologists discovered a 50,000-year-old twisted cord fragment on a Neanderthal stone tool from Aubry-Dumaras in France. This discovery hinted at knowledge of fiber manipulation, twisting, braiding, binding, skills that would have been indispensable for lashing together wooden frames or securing hide panels to bone supports. Their hands, too, were tools. Neanderthal anatomy reveals powerful grips and broad fingertips. While suited to grasping, pulling, and manipulating rough materials, these physical traits, combined with precision-crafted tools, enabled Neanderthals to work with a range of materials. Whether scraping hides, driving wooden pegs, or packing snow and mud as insulation, their physical capability matched their mental adaptability. The spatial layout of tools within shelters also tells a story. At some sites, different tool types are clustered in distinct zones. Scrapers near hearths, cutting tools near butchering areas, pointed tools stored separately. This organization implies forethought, a kind of domestic logic that extended beyond hunting into the realm of construction. Building was not an afterthought, it was part of a structured life. This deepening relationship with tools changed how Neanderthals interacted with their environment. They no longer relied solely on what nature gave them. They altered it, reshaped it, and adapted it to their needs. A tree was not just a tree. It was a pole, a beam, a lever. A bone was not just refuse, it was structure. The landscape became a hardware store, and the Neanderthal toolkit the key to unlocking its potential. These innovations were not static. Over time, tool complexity increased. Composite tools, stone points hafted onto wooden shafts with adhesives like birch pitch, demonstrate even greater ingenuity. Such tools, while often linked to hunting, could also serve in shelter construction. A spear point could double as a punch or wedge. A sharp flake could shave wood. Versatility was the hallmark of Neanderthal toolmaking, and it allowed them to thrive across a mosaic of environments. Their craftsmanship laid the foundation for more complex architectural thinking. With each generation, knowledge was likely passed through observation and repetition. Children learning from elders, groups working together, skills honed around fires and in forest clearings. These tools, both physical and cultural, would serve them in constructing not only homes, but entire lifeways, resilient to the Ice Age's most brutal tests. As Ice Age winters closed in with biting winds and relentless snowfall, Neanderthals faced an unforgiving test of survival. Building a shelter was only the first step. Keeping it warm and livable through months of sub-zero temperatures required a new level of innovation. To withstand the cold, Neanderthals developed a variety of winter strategies, layering materials, insulating their structures, and erecting windbreaks that revealed a practical mastery of environmental adaptation. The construction of insulated homes began with selecting the right materials. Hides taken from animals like mammoths, bison, and reindeer were not simply used for clothing. They were critical components. Toolkits and construction techniques. In winter shelter design, thick, fatty blubbers provided an effective barrier against wind and frost. Neanderthals likely layered these skins over wooden or bone frameworks, overlapping them tightly to minimize exposure. The practice of scraping, softening, and possibly even smoking hides to increase their durability ensured that shelter walls were not only functional but long-lasting. Insulation beneath the feet was just as vital as protection overhead. Ground contact leached body heat quickly, especially in frozen or damp environments. Neanderthals likely laid animal skins, moss, dry grasses, or even branches across the floors of their shelters. These created barriers between the cold earth and their bodies during sleep. Archaeological sites show compacted layers of organic material near hearths, suggesting efforts to create warmer living zones within shelters. In some cases, thick mats may have been replaced or repaired periodically, another sign of sustained habitation and planning. Walls and roofs were not left to chance. In areas with abundant snow, Neanderthals may have used the environment itself as insulation. Snow, when compacted, forms an effective thermal layer. It's possible that they packed snow along the outer walls of shelters to keep wind out and heat in, turning the cold into a form of protection. The same technique is used in snow shelters by modern Arctic populations, a parallel that hints at convergent survival strategies across time. The entrances of shelters were among the most vulnerable spots. Cold air easily crept in, and valuable heat escaped. To counter this, Neanderthals likely built windbreaks, external barriers constructed from branches, bones, or stacked stones that diverted the wind's path. These were often placed in front of shelter openings or arranged in crescent shapes around exposed camps. Some may have built double-door systems, using hanging hides, reducing airflow and conserving heat within the living space. These small but deliberate architectural choices made the difference between discomfort and death. Fire remained at the heart of every winter shelter, but it could only heat so much space. To conserve warmth, Neanderthals likely slept in close quarters, huddled around the fire on padded ground. Family groups may have shared coverings, animal hides draped over multiple individuals to preserve shared body heat. Such proximity served both physiological and social needs, fostering closeness and communication.
Even during the coldest months, the structure of shelters, often narrow and low, helped trap heat and limit cold air circulation. Smoke management was a constant concern. While enclosed shelters held warmth better, they also trapped smoke from indoor fires. Neanderthals adapted by building low oxygen fires that burn slowly, producing less smoke but more lasting heat. Ventilation may have been achieved through small openings or temporary gaps in the hide roof, adjusted as needed. In deeper caves, they likely placed fires near the entrance or used the natural chimney effect of the rock structure to expel smoke safely. These strategies show a keen awareness of balance, preserving warmth while avoiding suffocation. The effectiveness of these winter techniques is evident in their ability to survive in regions as cold as the northern Balkans, Central Europe, and parts of Western Asia, areas where winter temperatures routinely dropped well below freezing. Their success was not based on luck or instinct alone. It was the result of layered innovations tested through experience and adjusted over time. Neanderthals turned the elements to their advantage, creating microclimates within shelters that defied the brutality outside. These techniques also expanded their range.
With effective winter adaptations, Neanderthals could move into colder, higher altitude regions, once considered marginal sites, like Gros Turon in France and Mesmoya Cave in Russia, demonstrate long-term habitation in icy environments, sustained by well-insulated shelters and cold weather strategies. Their resilience was not static. It evolved with climate shifts, resource availability, and learned knowledge. Shelter became not just protection, but possibility. As the cold deepened, so did their understanding of how to live with it. Every new layer of hide, every stone placed to deflect the wind, every ember preserved through the night. These acts formed a culture of adaptation. In the white silence of Ice Age winters, Neanderthals didn't simply endure, they engineered their survival. Within the cold walls of caves and beneath the domes of hide-cover huts. Neanderthal shelters were more than structures. They were social spaces. They were places where families gathered, where tools were made, where meat was shared, and stories, perhaps, told. These shelters did more than shield Neanderthals from the cold. They shaped how groups interacted, how they organized daily life, and how they built a sense of belonging. Archaeological evidence from sites such as La Ferricie and Rocca Marcel in France offers intriguing glimpses into how space was used. Hearths often sat at the center of shelters, serving as the literal and symbolic heart of the home. Around these hearths, spatial organization emerged. Zones where tools accumulated, where bones were discarded, and where sleeping or resting likely took place. The repeated use of the same locations for specific tasks points to an internal logic, one shaped by social roles and shared routines. This division of space hints at the structure of Neanderthal groups. Shelters needed to accommodate both activity and rest, movement and stillness. A typical Neanderthal group may have included 10 to 15 individuals, too many for constant closeness, too few for rigid hierarchies. Space helped mediate these dynamics. Certain areas were probably reserved for specific activities, butchering meat, working flint, preparing hides. Others were likely more private, used for sleep, childcare, or quiet observation. These zones suggest that daily life was not chaotic, but patterned, built on customs, reinforced through repetition. The location of objects within these shelters tells a deeper story. Flint flakes were not scattered randomly. They often appeared in clusters, possibly where individual artisans sat to work. Bones of large animals were found near hearths, but always in particular zones, suggesting designated butchering or cooking areas. In some sites, there is even evidence of storage piles of materials or organized placement of stone tools, indicating forethought and awareness of future needs. These details speak to a cognitive world where memory, planning, and cooperation played key roles. Children, too, left their mark.
Tiny footprints alongside larger ones at sites like Theopetra Cave in Greece suggest that shelters were multi-generational. The presence of tools sized for smaller hands and objects interpreted as playthings indicate that learning and imitation took place within these spaces. Shelters were not only for survival, they were classrooms where skills and customs passed from one generation to the next. In this way, the shelter was not just a roof over the head, but a container for cultural transmission. Social interactions shaped how space was managed. Firelight created a shared focal point, drawing people together.
For warmth, food, and communication around the hearth, there may have been quiet evenings spent repairing tools, murmured plans for the next day's hunt, or simple moments of silence in the glow of flickering flames. While we can't recover their words, the physical layout of their homes suggests a rhythm of communal living that required respect for space, cooperation, and shared effort. Conflict was likely minimal within such close quarters, not because tension didn't exist, but because survival demanded harmony. Disputes may have been managed through separation within the shelter, each zone offering refuge not just from the cold, but from interpersonal strain. Social bonds were essential within these confined spaces. Empathy, patience, and care were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Cooperation wasn't just useful, it was embedded into the walls themselves. Evidence of burials within or near shelters adds another layer to the social function of these spaces. At sites like Shanidar Cave and La Chapelle, Neanderthals intentionally buried their dead in carefully chosen spots. These were not discarded remains, they were placed with attention, possibly with ceremony. Such acts suggest that shelters were places of memory, where life and death were acknowledged within the same walls. The shelter held not only the living, but the echoes of those who came before. The spatial habits of Neanderthals also reveal something more subtle, a sense of belonging. To return to the same site, to rebuild in the same spot, to place hearths in the same location again and again. These choices imply more than practicality. They suggest emotional continuity, a connection to place that transcended mere survival. The shelter became part of identity, woven into the story of each group. And as these social spaces evolved, so did the behaviors they supported. The organization of shelter reflected the growing complexity of Neanderthal life, how they worked together, how they cared for one another, and how they built meaning into the most basic aspects of their existence. But even the most carefully structured home could not always remain in place. As seasons changed and herds moved, Neanderthals needed to adapt. Their next challenge would be movement, constructing temporary shelters that mirrored their knowledge but answered the demands of mobility. While caves and permanent shelters offered protection during long winters, Neanderthal life was not rooted in one place. Survival in Ice Age Europe demanded movement, following herds, searching for raw materials, responding to seasonal shifts. This mobility was not random, it was calculated and strategic. To support it, Neanderthals developed temporary camps and seasonal shelters, structures that balanced flexibility with protection, allowing them to endure in motion. Archaeological evidence from open-air sites such as La Folie in France and Beldwell-Herewater in Belgium points to a pattern of repeated short-term occupation. These sites show traces of hearths, scattered stone tools, and animal remains, markers of brief but purposeful stays. Unlike the deeply stratified layers of long-term caves, these sites often show a single horizon of activity, suggesting days or weeks rather than months of habitation. Yet even in this brief time, Neanderthals established order, built fires, and likely constructed simple windbreaks or hide tents. In these mobile settings, shelter construction had to be fast, efficient, and adaptable. Neanderthals likely used lightweight frameworks made from branches or saplings, covered with animal hides and secured with stones. These structures could be assembled within hours and dismantled or abandoned as needed. They were not meant to last seasons, but they didn't need to. Their purpose was to shield from sudden cold, wind, or rain during a temporary stop. The decision to move was often tied to food. Herd animals such as reindeer, mammoths, and wild horses migrated with the seasons. Neanderthals tracked these herds across hundreds of kilometers, relying on memory and experience to predict where animals would pass. Their shelters followed this rhythm, springing up like outposts across the landscape. Over time, certain places became known stops, safe zones where temporary homes could be raised quickly using familiar materials. These patterns reveal an intimate connection with the land and its seasonal pulse. Mobility also demanded portability. While permanent camps might accumulate heavy tools or large bones, temporary shelters used more compact and versatile gear. Toolkits in these camps often include unmodified flakes and small cores, easy to carry, quick to use. Food processing was streamlined. Hunters may have butchered animals in the field, carrying only selected meat back to camp. Fires were smaller, more contained, their hearths leaving shallow scars in the earth. Everything in these shelters spoke to movement, efficiency, and survival on the go. In some regions, seasonal shelters became semi-permanent during certain times of year. For example, in river valleys, where salmon or other seasonal resources appeared, Neanderthals may have paused for several weeks, constructing sturdier shelters from local materials. These camps blurred the line between temporary and permanent. They reflect a flexible strategy, one that could respond to changing conditions with remarkable speed. Neanderthals were not locked into one mode of living. They moved between them fluidly. The use of temporary shelters also points to a social dynamic centered on cooperation. Moving as a group required coordination, deciding when to leave, where to settle, how to divide labor. In temporary camps, tasks were likely shared. Some fetched wood, others set up coverings, others maintained a fire or prepared food. These small, mobile units reinforced group cohesion and mutual reliance. Each move, each shelter, was a test of their ability to adapt as a collective. Even children and elders had to be considered. Mobility did not mean excluding the vulnerable. Temporary shelters had to offer enough comfort and protection for all group members. This may have led to innovations in how hides were arranged, how warmth was retained, or how fire was used more efficiently. Their shelters were not crude lean-tos, but evolving expressions of a mobile lifestyle, practical, inclusive, and honed by experience. The landscape itself shaped these journeys. Mountains, rivers, and forest lines guided movement, marked boundaries, and determined what was possible. Neanderthals learned to read the land like a map, not in symbols, but in experience. The memory of where a good shelter could be built, where water flowed clean, where game had passed in past seasons. These memories formed a collective intelligence that allowed them to travel without becoming lost. As climate continued to shift and habitats changed, this mobility became even more critical. Harsh winters forced retreat, while warmer interglacial periods allowed exploration. Their ability to construct shelters quickly, to carry the essentials, and to adapt their building strategies to each new environment was key to their survival. It allowed them to spread widely, to inhabit regions as diverse as the Iberian Peninsula, the Russian plains, and the Middle Eastern highlands. With every temporary camp, Neanderthals demonstrated a deep mastery of motion, of living not in one place, but across many. Always prepared, always adjusting. These shelters, though fleeting, left impressions in the soil and stories in the stone. And they formed a crucial link in the chain of human evolution, teaching later hominins how to move with the world, not just through it. For thousands of years, Neanderthal shelters were shaped by necessity and erased by time. Yet in caves, soils, and ancient hearths, faint signatures remain.
traces of warmth and life buried beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence. These fragile remnants, uncovered by archaeologists with painstaking care, allow us to reconstruct the homes Neanderthals once built and the lives, temporary camps, and mobile living they led within them. At sites like La Pharisee in southwestern France, archaeologists discovered not only stone tools and hearths, but patterns that suggest deliberate spatial planning. Layers of ash, charcoal, bone fragments, and tool debris formed distinct zones, revealing how Neanderthals organized their living space. Fire pits were positioned near the center, surrounded by areas of butchery, tool production, and rest. The repetition of these spatial
arrangements in multiple layers implies long-term occupation and perhaps even cultural continuity in the open-air site of Mladova I in Ukraine. One of the most dramatic examples of Neanderthal shelter building was unearthed, a circular structure built from over 100 mammoth bones. Though the wooden framework has long since vanished, the outline of the dwelling remains, filled with evidence of hearths and flint tools. The precision of the construction and the scale of material gathering point to complex planning, group effort, and a well-developed sense of architectural structure. Such a shelter was not only functional, it represented a powerful adaptation to a treeless, frozen landscape. Other sites like Gratu Ren and RC Circure reveal smaller traces. Thin ash lenses indicating fire use, stone flake concentrations, and bone assemblages sorted by size or species. These patterns speak of short-term camps or temporary shelters, their details recorded in soil rather than stone. Here, archaeologists interpret activity zones where Neanderthals paused, built fires, processed game, and then moved on. Each thin layer becomes a page in the long story of mobile survival. At Coombe-Grenelle, also in France, stratified deposits spanning tens of thousands of years show repeated use of the same cave layers. Layers of debris and ash build up like sedimentary memories, each one representing another generation, another winter, another fire lit in the darkness. The position of hearths and the recurrence of tool types suggest that Neanderthals returned to familiar locations, rebuilding in the same places and reusing the same domestic patterns. These sites become windows into a world where shelter was not a one-time act, but a cyclical practice shaped by memory and need. Beyond physical structures, small details offer profound insights. Burned bone fragments reveal not only diet, but fire management. Flint cores and retouched flakes show the tools of builders and hunters alike. The presence of red ochre hints at symbolic behavior, perhaps body decoration, or even ritual use within domestic spaces. Such findings challenge outdated views of Neanderthals as purely pragmatic. Their homes may have held meaning beyond survival, shaped by habit, memory, and perhaps even belief. Footprints discovered in ancient floors, such as those in Theopetra Cave in Greece, capture fleeting moments. A child walking across damp earth, an adult pacing near a hearth. These impressions, preserved by chance and uncovered millennia later, are intimate evidence of life in motion. They remind us that shelters were not only built structures, but lived-in spaces, where emotion, routine, and relationship took form. The way materials were gathered and used also leaves traces. Bones were selected for size and shape, hides cut and scraped, branches trimmed and positioned. These actions left marks, cut scores on ribs, wear patterns on tools, impressions in sediment where posts once stood. Taken together, they allow researchers to reconstruct not just what shelters looked like, but how they were built, used, and maintained over time. The distribution of Neanderthal shelter sites also reveals their environmental strategy. Coastal caves, river valleys, highland rock shelters, and open plain structures each reflects choices made in response to climate, resource availability, and social needs.
Mapping these sites shows patterns of seasonal movement, regional preference, and environmental adaptation. Each point on the map is a chapter of their architectural legacy. Importantly, Neanderthal shelters are not found in isolation. They exist in relation to landscapes, near hunting grounds, beside water sources, close to raw material outcrops. These connections speak to broader survival systems where shelter was one component of a complex adaptive strategy. Homes were placed with intention, constructed with available resources, and positioned within a matrix of environmental knowledge that enabled long-term success. The soil holds their memory, not in bricks or blueprints, but in layers of ash, circles of stone, fragments of bone, and echoes of fire. Through careful excavation and interpretation, archaeologists bring these homes back into light. The evidence is incomplete, the picture never finished. Yet every discovery adds to the growing understanding that Neanderthals were not passive creatures braving the cold. They were builders, planners, and caretakers of spaces that held meaning for themselves and their kin. The world of the Neanderthals was
not static over the hundreds of thousands of years they inhabited Europe and Western Asia. The climate shifted repeatedly. Glacial periods brought punishing cold, while warmer interglacials offered brief respite. These fluctuations were not minor. They reshaped entire ecosystems, altered migration routes, and redefined what shelter needed to be for Neanderthals. Surviving meant not only building homes, but adapting those homes to the ever-changing mood of the Ice Age. During colder phases, known as stadials, vast ice sheets advanced across northern Europe. Temperatures dropped, precipitation patterns shifted, and once forested regions transformed into open tundra. In such times, caves, though still valuable, were not always sufficient. Wind became stronger, snowfall heavier, and the need for insulation more critical. Neanderthal shelters had to evolve. Structures that may have been adequate in milder periods required reinforcement. Thicker hide coverings, snow-packed walls, and deeper hearths became essential features for trapping and retaining heat. These environmental shifts also affected available resources. In colder climates, trees grew sparse or disappeared altogether. Neanderthals in open steppe environments, particularly in places like Eastern Europe, turned to bone, especially mammoth remains, for shelter construction. Sites such as Malava I revealed a creative use of these materials in response to treeless landscapes. When wood was scarce, bones became beams, tusks became arches, and hides became walls. Each shift in the climate demanded a parallel shift in shelter design. In contrast, interglacial periods introduced warmth and humidity. Forests expanded, rivers flowed more freely, and game became more dispersed. With these changes came new challenges. Wetter environments meant shelters had to address moisture and runoff. Ground conditions deteriorated in these periods. Neanderthals likely elevated sleeping areas with branches or stone platforms to avoid dampness. Hearths may have been lined with more absorbent materials. The increased availability of wood allowed for more elaborate construction, perhaps even experimentation with new shelter shapes or layouts. Mobility also increased during warmer intervals, as prey animals roamed more widely. Neanderthal groups followed, setting up a series of temporary camps across broader territories. Shelter became lighter, more mobile, and faster to build. These seasonal structures relied on flexible design, quick to assemble, effective for short stays, and easily abandoned when weather or opportunity called for movement. Environmental stress did not freeze Neanderthals into fixed patterns. It pushed them into innovation. One of the greatest tests came during transitional periods, times when the climate swung unpredictably between warm and cold. These unstable phases, though often brief, caused ecological disruption. Herds moved erratically, floods followed droughts, familiar resources vanished, and once safe locations became inhospitable. In such moments, Neanderthals had to make swift decisions.
A known cave might become flooded. A valley once sheltered from wind might now face its full force. Here, flexibility in shelter construction became a survival trait in itself. Archaeological evidence reflects this dynamic adaptation at sites like Crab Cave in the Levant and Ripo Messina in Italy. Layers of sediment show alternating phases of use and abandonment. Sometimes, a cave would be heavily occupied for centuries, then abruptly abandoned, likely due to environmental stress. The next layer might reveal a different strategy. Lighter debris, smaller hearths, signs of brief visits rather than long stays. Each layer captures the response of a group adjusting not only to internal needs but to external pressures. These changing conditions also influenced how Neanderthals used fire. In colder periods, fire became a constant, maintained with great care and planning. In warmer times, it may have been used more sparingly, relocated outdoors, or even shared between groups. The ability to start and maintain fire in wet or windy conditions required skill that evolved alongside shelter design. Hearths were not static features, they too were adapted to match the climate's demands. Resource sharing and group
Documentary style may have intensified during periods of environmental stress. Larger groups might join temporarily to pull labor and materials, constructing bigger, more robust shelters. Alternatively, smaller family units could split off to reduce strain on dwindling resources, favoring smaller, more portable shelters. These decisions were not random. They were strategic, shaped by ecological understanding and group dynamics, honed across generations. Ultimately, the story of Neanderthal shelter under environmental stress is a story of resilience. Despite repeated climate upheavals, they persisted, adjusting techniques, redesigning homes, relocating settlements. They didn't vanish when the winds grew colder or the forests retreated. Instead, they modified their tools, restructured their shelters, and found ways to keep their hearths burning. This adaptive spirit was not born of convenience. It was carved from the necessity of enduring in a world ruled by change. As Homo sapiens began arriving in Europe around 45,000 years ago, the world of the Neanderthals began to shift again. But this time, the challenge came not from nature, but from another intelligent species. Though both humans and Neanderthals shared many survival strategies, their approaches to shelter building revealed distinct choices, shaped by different technologies, social structures, and adaptive philosophies. By examining how each built their homes, we begin to see how subtle differences in cognition and culture played out in stone, bone, and fire. Both groups occupied similar landscapes: cold open plains, forested valleys, and cave regions. But their use of these environments diverged. Neanderthals continued to rely heavily on caves when available, modifying them with hearths, windbreaks, and hide partitions. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, seemed more inclined to construct elaborate dwellings in open areas, even when caves were present. Sites like Kosteny in Russia and Pydmosty in the Czech Republic reveal large huts made from mammoth bones, reindeer antlers, and intricate arrangements of hides and poles. These structures were often larger than their Neanderthal counterparts, suggesting different ideas about community size, permanence, or symbolic expression. The tools used to build shelters also differed. Neanderthals relied on the Mousterian toolkit, robust, practical, and highly efficient for tasks like scraping hides or shaping wood. Homo sapiens, by contrast, expanded their toolkit with new materials and composite designs. They began using bone and antler more frequently, not only for tools, but also for structural elements. Their blades were thinner, more standardized, and often more specialized. This may have allowed for more precise shelter construction and possibly the creation of lighter, more flexible structures. One of the most striking contrasts lies in the symbolic treatment of space.
While Neanderthals certainly organized their shelters and may have used pigments like ochre, Homo sapiens left behind unmistakable signs of symbolic thinking in their dwellings, from engraved bones to decorative objects and painted walls. Their homes sometimes doubled as canvases of meaning. The appearance of carved figurines and personal ornaments in living spaces points to a growing emphasis on identity, ritual, and expression. While Neanderthals may have had symbolic behaviors, they left behind fewer traces in their shelters to confirm it. Fire use also reveals differences. Neanderthals built hearths in central positions and tended them carefully, often reusing the same fire pits for generations. Homo sapiens, while similarly fire-dependent, experimented with hearth placement.
Sometimes building multiple fires in larger shelters, possibly to accommodate more people or perform distinct activities. In some sites, there's evidence of separate zones for heating, cooking, and crafting, suggesting more complex spatial planning, and possibly more layered social roles. The internal layout of shelters tells us even more. Neanderthal shelters often reflect compact group living, functional, communal, and efficient. Homo sapiens dwellings, while still practical, display increasing signs of compartmentalization. Sleeping areas, food storage, tool-making spots, and even waste disposal zones suggest a move toward defined spaces and perhaps an emerging sense of private versus communal areas. This partitioning may reflect growing social complexity, or simply new ways of thinking about domestic space. Mobility patterns offer additional contrasts. Both groups were mobile, but Homo sapiens seem to have constructed semi-permanent base camps more frequently. Their shelters sometimes included storage pits or food processing areas designed for longer stays. This semi-sedentary behavior points to a different rhythm of life, less reactive, more planned. Neanderthals, though, flexible and resourceful, maintained a more reactive mobility, closely tied to herd movements and environmental shifts. Materials also reflect differing levels of experimentation. Homo sapiens incorporated a wider variety of substances: ivory, shell, antler, even fibers for shelter and decoration. Evidence of woven mats, textile impressions, and braided cords suggests that their dwellings may have included layered furnishings or decorated interiors. Neanderthal shelters, though rugged and effective, seem more utilitarian, shaped by survival needs and constructed with readily available local materials. These differences should not imply inferiority. Neanderthal shelters were masterworks of environmental adaptation, efficient, resilient, and tailored to the harshest conditions. They reveal an intelligent response to immediate needs, built upon deep experience and practical knowledge. Yet the broader, more experimental range seen in Homo sapiens dwellings hints at a shift toward long-term planning, abstract thought, and symbolic life. This subtle divergence in shelter design parallels the broader evolutionary story unfolding between the two species. When both groups coexisted, their shelters sometimes appeared side by side in overlapping regions. For a brief time, two kinds of humanity built homes on the same frozen ground, warmed by fire and bounded by hide and wile. And while Homo sapiens would ultimately spread across the globe, the shelters of the Neanderthals remain as silent witnesses. Stones and bones arranged in patterns that still speak across thousands of years of endurance, ingenuity, and the enduring human need to build and belong. As the Neanderthals approached the final chapters of their long existence, their shelters, once symbols of adaptability and resilience, became markers of a struggle against mounting pressures. Between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, their world narrowed.
Climate instability intensified, prey populations declined, and Homo sapiens expanded across Europe, bringing new competition and cultural complexity. In this crucible of change, Neanderthal shelters evolved once more, not through innovation, but through necessity and response. Archaeological sites from this final period reveal changes in settlement patterns. In some regions, such as southern Spain and Gibraltar, Neanderthals retreated into isolated refuges. Caves like Gorham's Cave, deeply nestled in cliff faces overlooking the Mediterranean, became last strongholds.
These shelters were familiar, defensible, and near reliable coastal resources. But they also suggest contraction, a species pulling inward, holding on to the edges of a continent they once dominated. Inside these final shelters, the signs of stress accumulate. Hearths grow fewer and smaller. Tool diversity declines. Layers of occupation thin out, suggesting shorter stays or fewer occupants. At places like Zapharia and El Salt, evidence points to a dwindling population, one that returned to the same sites, but with less vigor, less frequency. Their homes, once buzzing with activity and cooperation, became quieter, more intermittent, and ultimately abandoned. Still, the will to survive persisted, even in the face of decline. Neanderthals continued to build, adapt, and shelter in areas where wood was scarce. They reused bones from previous kills. Where heights were limited, they relied more heavily on natural rock formations and made greater use of insulating soil or vegetation. Fire remained central, but there is some evidence that fire use became less consistent, perhaps reflecting the loss of knowledge, reduced cooperation, or the exhaustion of available fuel. In these waning centuries, encounters with Homo sapiens became more frequent. Whether through competition, displacement, or occasional cooperation, the presence of another intelligent species reshaped the Neanderthal world. It's likely that some sheltering practices were observed, copied, or even shared. At shadow Peronian sites like Grat Joran, tool types typically associated with Homo sapiens appear alongside Neanderthal remains, blurring the line between cultures. These hybrid assemblages hint at a complex interplay, one where Neanderthals may have attempted to adopt new techniques in shelter construction or organization, but with limited success. Their shrinking populations also meant shrinking communities. Smaller groups lacked the manpower for large-scale construction. Family bands, once capable of building mammoth bone huts or maintaining multiple hearths, now had to make do with simpler forms. Shelters became more rudimentary, quickly assembled, minimally insulated, focused purely on immediate needs. The sense of permanence found in earlier sites gave way to impermanence, a symptom of fading stability. Despite these hardships, care for the old and the dead persisted. Burials continued, albeit more sparsely. In Shanidar Cave, one of the final known Neanderthal interments shows signs of careful placement, perhaps even ritual. These acts suggest that even as sheltering strategies diminished, the emotional and symbolic life of Neanderthals endured. Their homes, no matter how temporary, still held meaning. They still offered a place to gather, to rest, to grieve. As their range contracted, the places they chose for shelter became ever more strategic. South-facing caves, land valleys with milder winters, and coastal areas with consistent food sources became prized locations. The same skills that had allowed them to navigate past climatic crises were now focused on survival in smaller fragmented territories. But the pressures were too great. Diminished genetic diversity, ecological strain, and increasing competition left little room for recovery. Their last shelters, no matter how well placed, could not shield them from extinction. The end did not come as a dramatic collapse. There were no burning villages, no battle lines. It was a quiet vanishing, stretched across generations. One season, a group failed to return to a known shelter. Another winter, a hearth remained cold. Over time, the shelters faded, left empty, then covered by dust, soil, and time. All that remained were the stones of old fire pits, the scatter of worked flints, the curve of bones, placed with intention. Long ago, in Final Shelters, Legacy and Cultural Significance. Those final dwellings, we do not see failure, we see persistence. Even as conditions worsened, Neanderthals continued to do what they had always done: build, adapt, and protect one another. Their shelters in this final age were not monuments to loss, but testaments to endurance. Each fire lit, each wall raised, each hide stretched against the cold, was a final echo of a people who had thrived in the harshest climates known to humanity. Long after their final hearths went cold and their voices faded from the windswept plains of Ice Age Europe, the legacy of Neanderthal shelter endures. Not in monuments or towering architecture, but in the quiet traces left behind in soil and ash. These remnants, scattered across caves, riverbanks, and open steppes, tell the story of a people who mastered survival through ingenuity, resilience, and care. Their shelters were not just places to endure the cold. They were reflections of community, adaptation, and identity. Through the archaeological lens, each hearth and bone-framed wall reveals the intellectual depth of Neanderthal life. Their use of fire was deliberate and constant, maintained across centuries and passed from generation to generation. Their construction techniques, though simple in form, show deep understanding of materials, landscape, and climate. Whether reinforcing a cave entrance against the wind or erecting a dome-shaped hut in an open tundra, every structure speaks to knowledge honed through trial, memory, and shared experience. The spatial logic within their shelters offers insight into their social world. The arrangement of hearths, tool zones, and sleeping areas implies cooperation and planning. The presence of children and the care of the elderly within these spaces hint at emotional bonds that shaped their daily lives. These were not transient camps defined only by survival. They were homes, constructed with care and infused with continuity. In fire, light, and shelter, the Neanderthals created meaning amid the harshness of nature. What remains most striking is how deeply their lives were woven into the environments they inhabited. Their shelters did not dominate the land, they responded to it. In this relationship between humans and habitat, Neanderthals reveal a model of living with the land rather than over it. They read the wind, followed the herds, built with what was available, and altered their strategies with each season's challenge. Their story is one of constant dialogue with the world around them. Modern scientific discoveries have deepened our appreciation for their sophistication. Microscopic residues on tools show they manipulated fibers. Burnt remains reveal complex use of fire for cooking and crafting. Soil chemistry uncovers patterns of long-term occupation, suggesting memory of place. And genetic studies now confirm that Neanderthals live on within us, not only in the traces found in our DNA, but in our capacity to adapt, build, and create comfort against adversity. In the study of shelter, Neanderthals teach us that home is not defined by bricks or walls, but by what it protects and enables. Their homes were places where food was shared, skills were learned, and lives were lived. In that sense, the architecture of the Neanderthal world forms a bridge linking the deep past to the enduring human desire for warmth, safety, and connection. They remind us that the instinct to build is ancient and deeply human. Their ingenuity also challenges outdated perceptions. Once viewed as primitive or brutish, Neanderthals now emerge as thoughtful survivors,
engineers of warmth, comfort, and structure in a world that offered
little mercy. Their shelters reveal a flexible intelligence, one capable of responding to varied terrains and shifting climates. Their legacy is not a story of failure, but of success across hundreds of thousands of years. That they eventually disappear does not erase what they achieved in their time. The cultural significance of their dwellings continues to influence how we understand our own origins. Each fire pit uncovered, each hide-walled hut reconstructed in imagination, reshapes how we view the evolution of human behavior. Neanderthal homes weren't primitive stops on the way to modernity. They were expressions of a parallel humanity, rich with experience and innovation. Their shelters were places where early culture formed, where knowledge was transmitted, and where the human journey quietly advanced beneath the cold stars. In today's world, where shelter has become a symbol of permanence and luxury, the Neanderthal perspective reminds us of shelter's essential role: protection, belonging, and adaptation. Their legacy invites us to reflect not just on what we build, but how and why we build it. Their story speaks to the human capacity to create space within chaos, to carve warmth from frost, to form community in isolation, and to persist when survival is not guaranteed. And so, beneath layers of earth, behind the stone circles of ancient hearths, and within the silence of long-abandoned caves, the legacy of Neanderthal shelters remains. They are whispers from the deep past, reminders that long before civilization rose in stone and steel, humans had already learned to make homes from bone, hide, and other. Thank you for watching this video on how Neanderthals built their shelters and survived the cold. We hope you found it interesting and learned something new about their smart ways of living. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and subscribe to Stone and Spark for readers for more content like this. We will keep bringing you stories from history, science, and beyond. Your support means a lot to us. If you have any thoughts, suggestions, or ideas to improve our videos, please leave a comment below. We would love to hear from you and make our content even better for you.